Hello and welcome to Government Unit 4, pages 4 through 5. Today we're going to be talking about some of the differences between federal and state governments and the powers that they have. Let's get started. So federalism, this is an important term. Federalism is the idea that government and the powers that it has is going to be divided among many levels between the state and the federal government. And that's a very oversimplified way of looking at it, but that's all you really need to know now is that federalism is dividing that labor, not having it all centralized in just the power of the federal government, but not having the federal government powerless either, making sure that the states still have some powers and some level of independence. Now, the balance between the two is what this video is all about. How should we balance? And that's a decision that you're going to have to make for yourself as you are making voting decisions in the future. The 10th Amendment is kind of the key point here. It says that all powers not given to the national government or denied to the states are defaulted to the state. That means you, local people, that you get any powers that the Constitution forgot. That's a safety net to make sure that the federal government doesn't get stronger than it should. Because while the founding fathers did believe the federal government should have some power and some authority, they were afraid of it getting so much that it would nullify the power of the states and therefore the citizens themselves. So the 10th Amendment says that everything we don't specifically give, we being the founding fathers, to the federal government, those powers go directly to the states and the citizens in them. So what powers do the states have, and only the states? These powers are powers that the federal government cannot remove, and the federal government cannot impose their will upon. So these 5 powers that I'm going to go over, the federal government can only influence them if the state allows. Now, the federal government can try. They can offer money and say, hey, we've got a plan. We think you should take this plan, California, Nevada, Arizona, and we'll even give you some money if you do. But they can't force it. No matter what the incentive is, those states can still say, no, we don't want that plan. This is a state power and we have full power. So those powers include setting up local government. So are we going to have a mayor? Are we going to have a council, governor? How are we going to pass laws? How involved should the people be in creating laws? All those kind of decisions the states make up for themselves. The federal government, Congress, President, Supreme Court cannot tell us what to do there as long as we don't do anything that violates the Constitution. Setting up public school systems. How do we run our schools? Each state has full authority with no federal government intervention to decide what they will. Now, again, the federal government gets involved and they offer incentives for states to take their plans and put them into action. But the states always have the ability to say no or reject it because this is a state power, and a state power alone. Another power that the states have full authority over is setting up their own rules and regulations having to do with traffic and public safety, whether it's things like dealing with a drought or setting speeding limits and what the penalties are for breaking traffic violations and those kind of things. Only the states have that power. The federal government cannot make those rules without asking us permission to do so. Overseeing businesses, rules about how to regulate business. The state has to accept anything the federal government might want to do in this area. It's ultimately up to the states to decide, if there's some businesses we don't allow or what rules they have to follow in order to sell or produce or market, those kind of things. And finally, conducting elections. Each state decides for itself how it's going to conduct elections. That means, are we going to use computers? Are we going to do handwritten ballots only? When do you have to register? What time period do you have? Can a felon vote? Can a felon not vote? How long are the hours going to be open for you to come in and vote? All those kinds of things are decided by the state and the state alone. Even if the election is for a federal position like the president, doesn't matter. The state decides how that election is going to go down. All right, so now these powers are powers that are shared with the federal government. That means the federal government can do it and the local state government government can do it. They may not work together. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. They'll be separate departments, but they are powers that both can do. For example, collecting taxes. There's federal taxes and there's state taxes. Enough said. Providing public assistance. Things like food, welfare, food stamps, disaster relief. The states can have their own programs to deal with this, and the federal government also can have their own programs to help people that are in need of assistance. Setting up courts, because there's two sets of laws. There's state laws and there's federal laws, and then there's constitutional law to deal with. And you need to have a court for each level of law, because sometimes they overlap, but oftentimes they don't, because a law that will exist for one and it doesn't exist for the other. So both federal and state will have its own court systems. Both can borrow money. Both have bills to pay, and if they need to borrow money and increase their debt to do so, then they can do that independently of each other. And finally, enforcement of laws, just like with the courts. There's federal laws that may not have anything to do with the state, and there's state laws that the federal government doesn't really worry about and doesn't want to have to enforce if they're not worried about. So there are law enforcement agencies for the federal government, like FBI, CIA, and then there's local law enforcement, like SWAT teams and local police officers. State constitutions. Every state has its own constitution. There's the United States federal government constitution that you already know about, but each state has its own state constitution as a result of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This ordinance said a lot of things that probably don't matter that much to you, but one thing that does matter is they say that each state, when it gets admitted to the country as a state, has to have a constitution that was voted on by the people. Not just a few leaders who wrote it up and said, this is it. The people had to vote it in of that state. As a result, their constitutions in state governments tend to be very complex and much more lengthier than the United States Constitution, because the United States Constitution wasn't voted on by the people. I mean, it was kind of indirectly, but only representatives and members of the of Congresses and state legislatures voted on it, and it was written to be extremely difficult to change. State constitutions are not so difficult to change, but they're similar, and they'll have similar rules and rights because they can't violate the Constitution, but they tend to be much larger. I use Utah in this picture, but they're not especially different than, say, California or any other state. State constitutions are much more complex. Constitutional initiatives are built into many constitutions in which you as citizen can propose your own constitutional change, amendment, and that's a constitutional initiative. And you can make if you get enough support for it, then you can force a vote, and if enough citizens vote for it, it now becomes law, or it now becomes a change to your state constitution. You as an individual would have a much more difficult road to do that for the federal constitution, but a constitutional initiative makes it much more realistic for you to change the constitution of your state. The last thing I'm going to go over is the different arguments between state and federal government as to who should have the power when they both want to do the same thing and then there's a conflict. The side of the argument in which people believe that states should have the most power over the federal government believe the reason why is because, one, states know your needs better. The leaders of a state live in the same state you do, and then are therefore more likely to understand where you're coming from because they're from, if not exactly where you're from, but close to it. Also, as a result, citizens feel more connected to local leaders, especially mayors, city council members, because it's extremely easy to go and meet them and talk to them and have them meet you face to face and listen to what you have to say. That is impossible to do with the president. Almost impossible. prevents having power in the hands of the state prevents federal government from getting distracted from bigger national concerns like fighting terrorism and trade with other countries and protecting our borders nationwide. These are extremely important issues that individual states are limited as to how effective they can be, and so we want to, but they're still really, really important. So we want to make sure that the federal government is putting their full energy and focus on handling these very important issues that only the federal government can handle, and not get distracted by local smaller issues that the states could probably handle without help. And finally, it allows states to experiment with programs that we think might help the country, but we're not sure. So that way, if we try something out and it works, then we can adopt it to the rest of the nation. Or if we try something and it fails, well, that means only that state is hurt by it and not the entire nation. Now, on the flip side of the coin, people who argue that we need to have a very strong national government, the biggest argument is maintaining equal opportunity for all citizens, no matter where they live, keeping things equal for everybody. And also because there's just a lot of problems they feel are too big or too expensive for any one state to handle. And that's it. Don't forget the next Edmodo quiz, and I'll see you in class.